Okay, welcome everyone to the final session this afternoon. We indeed have a full house. It appears to be my fate to be called, dare I say hailed, to talk about, to introduce Jacques Ranciere. About 13, 14 years ago, a colleague invited me quite kindly and generously to give a paper at a conference in London. And I was so honored to be invited and get to travel to an international conference that I immediately said, yes, I'd love to give a paper. What's the topic? What's the thought of Jacques Ranciere? Happy to do it. Fantastic. After I sent the email, I had to turn around and figure out what the thought said, and who this person was, and look him up. And his thought has dominated much of my thinking for the last 13, 14 years, because about 4 or 5 years later, after I'd given that paper, and it turned into a journal article, there was a moment in time in English-speaking academia where the interest and intensity in Ranciere's thought just took off. And these invitations kept coming in over and over and over, people clearly putting the edited volumes together and saying, who's written on this figure? Oh, we'll ask him. And the invitations kept coming and I kept saying yes, until I reached a point where the number of invitations I accepted and works I had worked through meant that there was an entire book to be had here, and I needed to put that all together. And so those invitations led up through 2009 when I started saying no and tried to finish the book over the next few years, until a little while ago today when Michael came to me and said, I'd like to call on you to talk about, to introduce Jacques Ranciere. So here I am. But it is impossible to introduce Jacques Ranciere. After all, his work refuses the very idea of being codified in such a way, refuses the very idea that he has a theory, a philosophy. And let me assure you, this has a major impact on you if you are trying to write a book about his thought. Especially one that tries to maintain, as I did, a certain fidelity to those very refusals, to take them very seriously, and therefore commits itself to not writing an introduction. So while Michael may have thought I was well suited to give this introduction because I had written a book, the entire book was the refusal of an introduction. So this is my last refusal, I should say. For related reasons, I'm going to refuse the temptation here and now to place Jacques Ranciere on the grid of academic intelligibility, by which I mean by listing his positions, his publications, his numerous plaudits. I could do that, but even though we have extra time scheduled for this session, he would have no time to speak because I would still be talking about his work and accomplishments and importance. I also think, though, that to do so would be to subject him to a very sort of ordering of the police, a certain ideological hailing of which he, above all, has been the best critic. Now, we all know the cliched performative of introducing someone by citing the line that they need no introduction. But here, I think, and it's a brilliant stroke of luck for me, the phrase is more than just an idiomatic expression. It is a literal truth. If my count is correct, almost every speaker so far has cited Ranciere's work. And there can be no doubt that almost every one of us in the audience today, right now, is familiar, in most cases intimately familiar, with large parts of his amazing corpus. And for many of us, his work occupies a crucial location in that list of thinkers who have affected us most profoundly. Perhaps no thinker today has inspired so many readers across such a wide and diverse array of contexts, geographic, disciplinary, and otherwise, which I think we see expressed in the wonderful list of speakers that Michael and Amos put together for the conference. It's no surprise then how eager we all are to hear him speak today. And thus, without further ado, let me cite one last cliché by saying that I am truly, deeply honored to introduce to you Jacques Ranciere.
Can you hear me? Okay. So first, thank you, Sam, for this introduction. So also thank you to Michael, Eamon, and Kathy for organizing this conference and inviting me. And they offered me the opportunity of hearing many inspiring and thought-provoking talks and discussions. I only regret one thing, that they brought their generosity, a bit too far, as they asked me to give this final lecture. I feel myself unable to synthesize the richness of the issues and problems that have been raised during this weekend. Nor do I feel myself able today to give this kind of final impulse by opening new horizons and new paths for an emancipatory practice. Well, the best I can do today is to reformulate some basic hypotheses of intellectual emancipation and raise some questions, about their meaning today. So this is what I try to do, hoping that in accordance to the principles of intellectual emancipation, your capacity to learn here will exceed my capacity to teach. So, as my title indicates, my reflection will be centered on the issue of the UN, which has been set up by the organizers of our conference as the object of a specific pedagogics. Well, this task of unlearning obviously echoes the notion and the figure that I had set up in my own way when I published a book entitled The Ignorance Schoolmasters, with the subtitle 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation. So both titles, the title of the conference and the title of my book, entail the idea of a specific form of learning, which is a negative one, learning how to unlearn, teaching as an ignorant, learning the emancipatory virtue of ignorance. This idea raises two intertwined problems. Firstly, how are we to understand the type of negativity at work in this unlearning or this ignorance? Secondly, what is the exact target of this negative action? What is the positivity that is under attack? In other terms, what is at stake in matters of learning? Well, I shall start from the issue of negativity, and I wish to emphasize briefly what the negativity entailed in the ignorance of the ignorant schoolmaster is not. It's not a method of the tabula rasa, asking us to start again from scratch. It's not a question of finding the right way of acquiring the knowledge in the Cartesian manner, by getting rid of all the opinions, judgments, and prejudices that we had previously accepted. The reason for this is simple. The method of the tabula rasa, even though it challenges the established edifice of knowledge and the institutional forms of learning, shares with them one fundamental principle. The principle that there is one point from which one must start and one definite order that one must follow. Let us recall it in passing. It is also the belief that is shared by many alternative and even libertarian pedagogy theories and practices of pedagogy. And it is also the belief that is shared by most of the revolutionary theories when they denounce the role of the educational institutions in the system of domination. So, no tabula rasa. From the point of view of intellectual emancipation, there is only one opinion of which we must get rid, an opinion which, unfortunately, most of the radical methods forget to get rid of, the opinion of inequality. Now, such a statement forces us to engage in a close examination of the two terms, opinion and inequality, and of their connection. The opinion of inequality is not the opinion that human beings are unequal for this or that reason. An opinion is not what it is usually told to be. It's not a vague judgment present in our minds, and notably in uneducated minds, about things of which we have no clear knowledge. Instead, it is the very framework within which we get educated and acquire knowledge. Such, I think, is a great discovery that we owe to Jacques. The opinion of inequality is not a matter of judgments, it's a matter of structures. It is a framework within which we learn and know. within which this working is linked with that of all the other minds, within which, in short, the exercise of our intellectual capacity comes into agreement with the inequality of the social order. This coincidence between the exercise of our intellectual capacity and the unequal social order has been summed up by Jacques in one single notion, explanation or explication. I don't know what term I should use. My translator, my translator generally speak of explication. The dictionary and my dictionary doesn't even know this word in English. It only knows explanation. So perhaps sometimes I will shift from one word to another. Okay. Now this simple word implies the whole framing of the intellectual world according to two principles. But I would like to spell out that briefly by both following Jacques and translating his argumentation in my own terms and my own problematic. So two principles, a principle of extensiveness and a principle of progressiveness. I wish to examine their general formula before investigating the transformations that each of them has undergone and the new forms of their interconnection. In both cases, I think that this general formula of explanation is best understood a contrario, out of its contrary. That's why I try to analyze them in relation to the two principles that Jacques picked against the explicative logic. So, and I remember, which means I suppose that you know, which of course is a bit presumptuous. So the two main statements by Jacques that made him infamous. First, everything is in everything. And second, learn something and relate to it all the rest. By this principle, all men have equal intelligence. First, so learn something. This very simple command of Jacques is enough to deconstruct the logic of explanation. For the logic of explanation precisely says you cannot learn something. As long as you are before something, you are before an opaque particularity which has its reason outside itself. You are before an opaque fragment of an unknown totality. So you cannot learn anything unless you understand its connection to the whole of which it is a fragment. The problem is that this whole has no delimitation. There is always a link that is lacking to catch up with it. So only those who have the knowledge of the whole can show you the relation of anything to all the rest. This whole is of course unattainable, unpresentable. This means that it must be presupposed as inherent to the power of making the links. It must be presupposed as the capacity of those who know how to know. Now this capacity in turn is demonstrated in a very specific way. It is demonstrated out of the incapacity of those who don't see the link. Well, this is what can be called the syllogism of the blind man, So a logic which has permeated most of the more radical critical projects. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the astounding summary of the Brechtian method once formulated by Roland Barthes. I quote, to see someone who doesn't know, to see someone who doesn't see is the best way to be intensely aware of what he doesn't see. With all my respect, for Roland Barthes, I would say, well, it is really the principle of what Jacques called stultification. Understanding the relation in this case amounts to understanding inequality. You cannot know anything without knowing your incapacity to make this link for which it is an object of knowledge. So you cannot learn anything without learning the inequality of intelligence. The inequality of intelligence between the intelligence of those who see the connections of the whole and the intelligence of those who are enclosed in the relation of a private, idiotic mind to particular things. Well, this difference is also a difference between two forms of temporality. A difference which can be explained, by reference, to a distinction spelled out long ago in Aristotle's Poetics. On the one side, in Aristotle's Poetics, there is a chronicle which tells how events happen in their particularity, one after another. On the other side, there is a poetic plot, which tells how those events have been made possible, according to the rules of necessity or verisimilitude. And this is this difference of temporality, which is both set at work and denied in the second principle of the logic of explanation, the logic of progressiveness. Again, we can best understand it a contrario out of the Jacobian learn something. The point is that the explicative logic on its part always says not learn something, but learn such thing, and then such other thing. The distance between something and the whole can only be covered by following a definite order, which is a definite correspondence between the unfolding of time and the unfolding of knowledge. Such a correspondence presupposes the existence of privileged knowledge, not only the knowledge of the connections that constitute the whole, but the knowledge of the progression according to which ignorance is able to make such or such a step in its travel. In short, the knowledge of ignorance or the knowledge of the inequality of intelligence. Such is the knowledge that is transmitted to the student at the same time as any new piece of knowledge. The knowledge of his or her incapacity to know how to move from one state to the next one. Progressiveness is the way in which the gap between the two temporalities is managed. On the one hand, the gap is denied. The distance between ignorance and knowledge is only a matter of time, and the time of education is a time within which precisely the distance will be dismissed. On the other hand, each step in that progression reopens the gap between those who live in the succession of the things happening one after another and those who are the intelligence of the whole. This is how the two principles are in accordance. In a way, the principle of progressiveness is only a consequence of the inegalitarian logic contained in the principle of extensiveness. But at the same time, it is a principle that makes it a social institution. The institution whose timetable is specifically devoted to the relation between ignorance and knowledge. The schooling system gives an institutional framework to the coincidence between three times: the time of the acquisition of knowledge, the time of development of the individuals, and the time of development of the society. Which means that it gives an institutional framework to the reproduction of the opinion of inequality under the guise of the progress of individuals toward knowledge and of the progress of society toward equality. In short, explication means much more than a specific academic exercise. It is a configuration of the whole world of experience. It is its topography and its timetable. This is why what has to be unlearned is much more than a matter of pedagogical methods. Intellectual emancipation is not an alternative pedagogy for two reasons. First, the learn something and relate to it all the rest, and the everything is in everything, do not define the right method for teaching and learning. Instead, they dismiss the very idea of the right method. All right methods are in keeping with the principles of explanation and stultification. They all boast on knowing how to know. Therefore, they all propose to start from the right point. They all share the presupposition of this whole, which is at the same time given and subtracted. Instead, the emancipatory method suppresses the two characters that are set up by the very dramaturgy of explanation, the pulse and the agoges's guide. It says there is no accredited guide because there is no right point of departure and no right order. The whole is everywhere. For instance, in Jacques's dramaturgy, the book that is in your hands is a whole from which you can discover your own capacity of making an infinite number of connections, hence your capacity of making links and making wholes in general. The only condition of this operation is an opinion, the opinion of the equality of intelligence, the opinion that there is only one intelligence and that the master and the students are only two speaking beings, two adventurers waving their paths in the forests of things and signs. From this, we can deduce a second reason for which intellectual emancipation is not an alternative pedagogy. it is not about teaching and learning. It's about equality and inequality. Or rather, it's about teaching and learning only to the extent that their relationship embodies the logic of inequality. The social institution of inequality is not limited to the academic forms of transmissions of knowledge. It is present all over the surface of human relationships. Wherever the acts of speaking, writing, reading, listening, seeing, etc., take on the form of relations between commanding and consenting, guiding and following, showing and perceiving, informing and being informed, and a multiplicity of such relationships which frame the territory of our experience and draw the path on which we can move over this territory. So what has to be unlearned is the logic of explication. Now there are two ways of viewing this unlearning, which imply two different uses of the negation. The first one conceives the negation in the form of forget it, leave it aside, move on the side, and this is the way in which Jacques conceived of this unlearning, letting the institution carry out the endless task of perfecting its perfect explanations and move on the side over the wide free spaces neglected by the explicators to open the multiple ways of verifying the equality of intelligence. Unfortunately, we have no more the possibility to think of it in its terms. We have not, because since Jacques' time, the principle of extensiveness and the principle of progressiveness have taken on new forms and allied with each other in new ways that have entirely mapped the vacant territories on which he proposed to find new ways of knowing something and relating to it all the rest. The reason for this is simple. All those vacant spaces have been integrated into the territory of knowledge. Such is the work that has been implemented by the infinite extension of a new science, which was still in its childhood in Jacques' time, social science. Social science has waged an endless war against ignorance. It has invaded all the territories where science had heretofore disregarded to go. It found that in every section of those territories there was something worth knowing. It showed that all those portions of knowledge were linked in the knowledge of the global system. And by the same token, it made ignorance itself the object of an ever increasing body of knowledge, explaining why the ignoramuses were unable to know what was before them, just at hand. For a long time, this infinite extension had been associated with the promise of equality, since the global connection was a connection of a system of domination. Its knowledge was told to forge the weapons of liberation, including the territories of misery, wildness, and ignorance in the empire of science, was a way of making science a weapon of a collective action, which would erase misery, wildness, and ignorance. Well, the problem is that this egalitarian project was entirely taken into the temporal logic of the system, which it was destined to destroy. The logic of progressiveness, the logic of the inequality of intelligence, separating those who can understand the connections of the whole and those who are entrapped in the universe of the particular, and all the more separated from their own experience, as this experience has been entirely captured in the nets of science. In such a way, the promise of equality carried by social science was ultimately absorbed by the egalitarian logic. On the one side, it was overturned. The science of the global system of domination, which was destined to provide the ways of destroying it, became the science of its necessary reproduction. On the other side, the equality of social science came to be identified with the equal availability of any phenomenon to become an object of science. This is what I would call the cultural turn of social science. But during the last decades, we have witnessed an incredible increase of research dealing with all aspects of media culture, visual culture, popular culture, minority cultures. The engagement of many film and media scholars with the extensive study of high or low quality TV series, the constant annexation to the territory of research and academy of all forms of popular entertainment, youth culture, ethnic music, dress codes of all youth groups and subgroups, and so on. Well, the introduction of all this material in academic research and teaching, well, has often been held as a recognition of the equal dignity of all producers and consumers of cultural practices. Against the old aristocratic definition of culture, the new cultural studies have affirmed with one of their theoreticians that there is no outside to culture. And well, during our conference, Jacques, Augustin and Paul Bowman have eloquently shown how we can profit from looking at the operations of food and the practices of art at work everywhere. Well, but I think there is also the reverse side of the coin. The inclusion of all social practices, in the empire of science also works as a form of dispossession that grabs hold of any form of occupation of entertainment of the ordinary people to make them its object. So the no outside to culture may become the proclamation that since there is no hierarchy, nothing and nobody will escape the grip of science. So there is no space left outside of science, outside science. This new extension of the principle of extensiveness ties up with the new progress of the principle of progressiveness. There is no time outside of science. This connection, I think, is best epitomized by the form of popular knowledge that has expanded at the same rhythm as the academic development of social science. I mean journalism. In the past, journalism was accused either of lying or of sticking to the surface of things. Contemporary media are accused of drowning us in an ocean of news and images that we are unable to master. I think that both accusations, are beside the point. The banality of the newspaper is nothing else but the popularization of the explications of social science, which precisely turn the chronicle of the everyday into the connections of scientific knowledge. And the media don't drown us in an ocean of images. On the contrary, they select images, they reduce them to the mere illustration of their meaning, as it is explained hour after hour by experts in sociology, political science, etc., etc. So their function is to create consensus, which means the perfect correspondence between sense and sense, between the perceptible and the thinkable. It is to produce and reproduce this correspondence without any interruption, to match up at any time, any event with its explication. In such a way, the knowledge of society comes to be coextensive with the life of society. And the demonstration of this correspondence occupies the entire time of each day. Of course, this ceaseless demonstration of correspondence is at the same time, according to the logic of explanation, a twofold demonstration of inequality. On the one hand, it continuously reproduces the distance between the common people who undergo the events of the news, the victims of war, violence, natural disasters, economic collapse, deindustrialization, etc., who appear briefly on the screens, and sometimes say one or two sentences. And on the other side, the experts who can explain these events. And on the other hand, it ceaselessly reproduces the ignorance of the readers, spectators, or listeners, who are shown at every moment that they do not understand the most prosaic events if they were not given explication by the experts. And this is how the two principles get increasingly tied in with each other. The coextensiveness of science and society is presented in a temporal form that equates it with the ceaseless reproduction of inequality. In such a way, the logic of explanation saturates the whole field of experience and expands over its whole surface. A coincidence between the time of social science and the time of the everyday, which is also a distance indefinitely reproduced between the actors of the everyday and that coincidence of fact and rationality. So the pedagogical order now covers the whole social fabric. Not only do the teachers and the textbooks explain, all our institutions, our governments, the myriad of committees and subcommittees that they create, the intellectuals, the experts, and the media are all committed to the task of endlessly explaining everything, from the hard constraints of the global market to the deep trends revealed by the last opinion polls or the civilization crisis witnessed by the most trivial events. In such a way, the reasons of power are increasingly equated with the reasons of science, which means that any resistance to those reasons becomes a manifestation of ignorance. At the end of the day, the social order is simply equated with the inequality of intelligence. So the logic of explanation is much more than a matter of schooling and pedagogy. It's a time machine producing, and I use the term, of course, with no reference to dollars. It's a time machine producing at the same rhythm an imaginary concordance and an actual discordance of time. And this is, I think, in this context, but we can think of the transformation of the educational system, and not only the university. Well, I'm thinking here of the process of harmonization of European diplomas known as the Bologna process. This harmonization makes much more than creating equivalences between diplomas. It constructs an ideal uniformity of degree courses so that the time spent to get those degrees signifies by itself the knowledge that has been acquired. This equivalence thus becomes part of a dreamed harmony between the time of the global economic process and the lived time of the individuals through the adjustment between the skills. So, some told a lot about this concept of scale. So for the adjustment between the skills that have been acquired and the job opportunities resulting from their adaptation to the forms of economic development. Well, the hitch, of course, is that the job opportunities are not so much determined by the progress of science and technology as they are by the play of financial speculation. But this is precisely the way in which the play of concordance and discordance, success and failure reaches its perfection. On the one hand, the less the reality of the market verifies the concordance of times, the more the educational institutions must embody the fiction of that concordance. If they cannot open the gates of the business world to their students, they must at least work as private firms submitted to the rules of good management. So the universities and the research teams, notably in my country, which is a bit late in this process, of course. So it takes some kind of caricatural aspect in my country. But the universities and research teams are invited to merge like companies in order to weigh more in the Shanghai ranking. And they get funds if they follow research programs that bureaucratic committees select as key teams destined to perfect the perfect harmony between scientific research and economic prosperity. Well, of course, the proof of this harmony is infinitely delayed. The time of the educational institutions never catches up with the time of the global economy. But the main function of the machine of concordance is precisely to reproduce indefinitely a discordance that the actors of the system, students, professors, researchers, must experience as their own failure, as their own incapacity to seize the opportunity that the system puts in their hands. Well, 40 years ago, there were big claims, in my country for the reform of the system of education. And those claims were predicated on the argument that the professors were definitely failing to achieve the end of the system, which at that moment was still thought to be promoting equality from the transmission of knowledge. Was a problem, I think, that now reform came, but when it came, it took on an unexpected shape, Reform, in a way, meant the rationalization of the production of failure and shame. The machine works to prove the incapacity of the agents of the system to fulfill a promise, which is no more a promise of future equality, but a mere promise of correspondence with one's own time. Well, this might be my contribution to the discussion raised, by Sam Chambers' brilliant paper this morning. The logic of explication, as the social logic of domination, exceeds any economic logic in terms of return on investment. The production of skills, or the production of knowledge as well, is at the same time a production of incompetence or ignorance, which means that its success also consists in producing failure. So the explanatory system appears as a kind of principle of saturation, inscribing the presupposition of inequality in all the forms of exercise of intellectual activity. It's no more an affair of pedagogy and of pedagogical relationships. On the one hand, the explicative logic of the system of education itself rests on the bureaucratic programming of the concordance and discordance of temporality, much more than it does on the forms of transmission of knowledge. And on the other hand, it's present everywhere, in the framing of the perceptible, the set of relationships between the perceptible and its meaning, and the modes of causal linkage at work in the most trivial news bulletin, as well as in the definition and distribution of the academic disciplines. If it is so, the negative operation of unlearning can no more be thought as a target it, as exploration of the vacant spaces outside the academic system. Instead, it takes place inside the fabric of explanation which covers the whole territory of experience. And it must be a process trying to untie the threads that the explicative logic has weaved between the facts and their knowledge, the things and their meanings, the images and the words, the events and their causes. Well, I would call this process a process of unexplaining or unexplicating, if you like. Well, and I want just, perhaps to present first a general idea and some examples of what I call an explicative, form of thinking and knowing. And second, perhaps ask some question, whether we can imagine an unexplaining institution. Well, unexplaining, so in general, means undoing the opinion of inequality. It means undoing the links that it has tightened everywhere between the perceptible and the singular. On the one hand, the unexplicative method unties the stitches of the veil that the explicative system has spread on everything. It restores the things that this system caught in its nets to their singularity and makes them available to the perception and the intelligence of anybody. On the other hand, it returns their opacity, their lack of evidence, to the modes of presentation and argumentation which were supposed to cast light on them. By so doing, it tries to substitute a community of equal speaking beings for the distribution of the positions opposing the learned and the ignorances, by opposing the subjects of knowledge to its object. Well, I wish just to throw some examples, to focus on some specific procedures of what I call explanation, working at some strategic points, from my point of view, some strategic points of articulation, undoing the explicative modes of presentation of things and production of meaning, which inscribe inequality in the landscape of the thinkable and the perceptual. Well, I'm first thinking, of operations of quantity, on quantity. Well, I recalled earlier that journalistic practice rested on a specific operation, selection, the selection of a few significant features destined to put order in the confusion of the multiple. Well, and we know how, for instance, the practice of reportage, the reporter must select in the decor of the multiple the few significant features, which make sense, of the situation by integrating, these features in a pre-existing interpretive grid, so that it is a certain arrangement of perceptual facts and of signification usually associated with those facts, a certain set of relations between the individual and the whole, the markers of individual reality, and the signifiers of statistical generality. Well, I just mention it very quickly, because I want to perhaps to emphasize what is at stake in a specific, event of sabotage, of the practice of journalism, the one that was practiced, by James A.G. and Walker Evans, when they were sent by fortune, among the Alabama sharecroppers, And what's interesting is that each of them, so the writer James A.G. and the photographer Walker Evans, each of them took up the part of the author, and each of them did the contrary of what was expected from him. The photographer Walker Evans did not provide the spectacle of this hodgepodge of things and persons, which is the usual landscape of misery. On the contrary, he showed an insignificant decor of order and scarcity. A section of wall in planks with small boards nailed askew and tin-plate cutlery and stencils supported by crossbeams. The corner of a room with a piece of rag and a clothesline between a straw-bottomed chair and a broom. A well-arranged dining room seen from the corridor with a washbowl in the foreground, etc. On his part, A.G. refused to select in the decor of the destitute sharecroppers the marks and signs that would have made their lives available for social consumption of signification. He played the part of the photographer by making a multiplicity of close-ups, turning any prosaic object or kitsch chromo into a relic encapsulating the whole sense of a destiny. So, his inventory of all the items, stored in all the drawers of the house, his attempt at capturing the light or the smell of the oil lamp, the grain and the scent of the pine planks of the wall, the breath of the sleeping bodies, his description of the innumerable patches, on the overall of a sharecropper. All this pushes to the extreme the democracy, meaning the impossibility of selecting, of which literature since Flaubert's time had been accused. Its exhaustive enumeration endows the consensual relationship between the whole and the fragment, the general and the particular. Instead, it connects those lives with the infinity of all the connections in space and time, contained in a single minute of the word, with that inexhaustible totality of every instant that literature in the age of Proust and Virginia Woolf had opposed to the journalistic selections of marks and signs framing consensus. This practice of disproportions thus opens out into a wider dismantlement, of the other category of experience. And while I'm referring in here, to the operation that I was obliged, to perform myself, in order to account for other operations performed in some 19th century workers' letters and diaries, that chance one puts into my hands. Letters exchanged by friends, telling the timetable of a day in the St. Simonian community, utopian community, or the Sunday walk of free workers, exchanging metaphysical hypotheses in country inns. Letters of a joiner inviting a cesspool cleaner to leave his degrading job, and answers of the cesspool cleaner celebrating this night job, which allows him to enjoy freedom during the day. Diaries of the same joiner narrating how by how the day at work in a factory or the day at work as a floor layer in the private house. While the usual logic of social science sees such documents as chronicle of the everyday, expressing the way in which individual workers at that moment could perceive and describe a situation which was itself part of a whole set of historical transformations of industrial capitalism. So it makes them documentary material that science has to explain through the causes that make it possible. Well, I was lucky enough to vaguely perceive that those diaries were not chronicles of the everyday. Instead, they were intellectual exercising, transforming the very way of living the everyday. They were part of a whole set of intellectual and physical exercises destined to break the very opposition between two modes of temporality, the time of mere succession allotted to those who live in the everyday, and the rational plot linking the causes and effects of action and knowledge according to necessity or verisimilitude. They broke the platonic distribution of times, destining the workers to limit themselves to the exercise of the aptitudes given to them by the god, because work doesn't wait. So those exercises work thus at the very point of articulation which inscribes inequality, the input of intelligence into the division of time. At this point, the objects of science change their status by affirming themselves as speaking being. And if it was so, the discourse destined to account for that change could no more be a discourse explaining those writings by locating them in the whole of the collections that made them possible. It could not be the discourse of a definite specialist of social science. Not only must this discourse erase those boundaries which annul the equality of the speaking beings in the division of the objects and territories of science, it had to erase the very difference between the modality of a discourse and the modality of its object. Erase the hierarchy of the comment explaining the words that are its object. And the only solution, for me, was to allow the voices, their voices and my voice, to penetrate into each other, which meant annulling the difference between the narration of the facts and the comments which explain it. This is how I adopted this theoretical form that I chose long after to call the scene. The scene is a form of implementation of the principle of the everything is in everything. It describes an event which is more than event, an event which at the same time shows us the border between the event and the non-event, what is ordinary and what is not, what has its place in a given order of signification and what is out or in between. So the very content, very content of my material imposed a specific form, breaking the border separating theory from profound experience in order to show how the whole of the theoretical question is at work, maybe at work in some little stories. So it is the scene is a mode of presentation in which the very difference between the words and sentences of knowledge and the words of sentences of those who are its object is suppressed. Both appear to belong to the same language and to the same capacity and thinking. There is not a language for empirical narration, a language for theoretical explanation. There is one language and one intelligence. So, what I had to do is not only to deliver the energetic potential, of presence, in those things, and what is what I try to do, by making the scenes resonate and be mirrored into one another. Proust once told that we should use his book as lens for which we look into our own life and experience. And the scene can be viewed as a little optical machine, allowing to look into the other scenes and make what is at issue in them appear in the foreground. Well, this practice can be told to be a matter of art, but we must understand art here in Jacobian way as an Hegelian practice of research, annulling the separation between the ignorance and the learned. More precisely, we can think of an art of equality, which works as a counter method, reconfiguring the way in which people, things, and events are put together, according to the dominant roles of articulation between the perceptible and the thinkable. A community of equals, just as a community of unequal people, is first framed through the way in which facts and meanings get into community. In the construction of a sentence, the narration of an event, the argument about its meaning, the comment of an image, the mode of existence of a character on a stage or a screen. And from that point of view, the extravagant inventory of James G, or, the construction of the sentence, in which made my voice indiscernible from the voice of those workers, can be, belong to the same logic of redistribution of the position that I analyzed, in various contemporary artworks. For instance, when Alfred Ujard redistributed at the same time the relations between the one and the multiple, and the relations between the word and the images. When he installs in the space of an exhibition a series of names, the image of a single look, and the narration or piles of slides of that single look in the place of the piles of massacred bodies which were expected. And I'm also thinking of the way in which a filmmaker like Pedro Costa erases the boundary between fiction and documentary, which means a distinction between two kinds of human beings, when by the play of some almost imperceptible displacements in the gestures and the tone of his characters, he allows two immigrant workers to move from the status of documentary bodies exhibiting the condition to the status of artistic subjects restaging that condition as their own story in a series of short scenes. Well, I tried to give some examples, of what I call an unexplicable operation. But of course, we must not be mistaken about the meaning of the very word operation. As a matter of fact, none of the operation, for instance, that I just spelled out was ever planned. It was produced by the constraint of the material itself. It was a way of reacting to a surprise or to taking up a challenge, a way of learning as an ignorant from texts which had certainly never been destined to teach me anything. So unlearning also means this, the dissociation between the acts of teaching and learning, the fact that you learn from somebody else something that never taught you. This means in turn that you don't teach what you have learned. You can just tell it. Invent a manner of telling it out of which possibly others will learn from you something else and something that you don't know. And this might be the deepest meaning, which also means the deepest challenge of this which is in the title of our conference, and in my own propositions about unexplaining. On the one hand, you can say there is something wrong with this negative prefix, the unexplanation, which is not a negative critique, not a denunciation of the explanation, it's an entirely positive practice, weaving a sensorium of intellectual equality, free from the barriers put by the explicative system. And in my case, it meant practicing a mode of writing for which the intellectual exercises of the intellectual exercise of those who were its objects, or the intellectual exercise of antique philosophers or contemporary sociologists were given the same mode of existence as performances of speaking beings, telling their own adventure. But the positive weaving of this fabric of equality can only be done by producing gaps in the normal complementarity of intellectual operations, searching, learning, knowing, teaching. The of unlearning or unexplaining doesn't simply mark a distance. It points to a dissymmetry or a dissociation at the heart of the normal logic of the intellectual exercises. We learn as ignorances and we teach as ignorance. We learn from people who never taught us. We don't teach what we have learned. We teach without knowing what we teach. The normal complementarity of the operation has been absorbed by the identification of the first term, of the chain, searching. And searching itself appears to be a way of learning or trying to learn what we are searching for. I think two consequences must be drawn from this. The first one is the irreducibility of the distance between the practices of intellectual equality and the logic of the explicative institutions. This irreducibility cannot be reduced itself to a distinction between the individual act of emancipation and the collective working of the social institution. So, proposition by Jacques that Paul Baumann recalled yesterday. The main point is not about individuals and collective, which means in passing that intellectual emancipation is not, as some critics have it, a theory of the neoliberal subject. The difference concerns the very structure of the intellectual operations and the mode of their linkage. The gap between learning, knowing, and teaching is a gap between temporalities. It subverts the temporal logic of the explicative institution, which needs to presuppose the homogeneity of the temporal process of learning, the better to divide it from the inside. The intellectual operation within the sensorium of intellectual equality can never coincide with those which contribute to the functioning of the explicative institution. Well, it is not at all, this is not at all, to say, that academics, teachers, researchers, and keynote lecturers, regardless of their good intentions, can do nothing but reproduce a system of domination. Instead, I wish to emphasize that it is always possible to create forms of manifestation of intellectual equality in the same places that are destined to the functioning of the explicative institution. But the creation of such places and times can never coincide with the revolution of the logic of the institution. The time of the institution, is determined by the programming of the intellectual operation and of their outcomes. And as I made the point earlier, this planning or this anticipation of the effects can become and often becomes a lie, but the institution cannot live without that fiction. And this is precisely what is lacking in the operations of intellectual equality. They depend on encounters which may happen or not happen, which may produce their effects, Well, in periods of time which are unpredictable, and those effects are unpredictable themselves. That's why they can never coincide with the temporality of the explicative institution. And again, the main point is not the transformation of the so-called pedagogical relation. I'm old enough, to have lived some experience, some moments of revolutionary effervescence, when it was proclaimed that the professors would not teach anymore. It was proclaimed by the students, or in the Maoist version, the workers were our masters. And we have known attempts at destroying the professor-student relationship and substituting open discussion for authoritarian lecturing. All this resulted in a quick return to the old order. And I think it did so because the distribution of the pedagogical positions rests on something more radical, which is the distribution of temporalities. This is also why there is no counter-institution inverting the logic of the institution. An explanation is not symmetric to explanation. It cannot build an alternative time machine. Its temporality doesn't allow a planning and anticipation of the effect. So I would say there is no unexplicative institution. There are a multiplicity of practices inside or outside the institutions, which enlarge the community of equal-speaking beings, open new paths for the circulation of food, new forms of access to knowledge, new ways of research. When Jacques spoke yesterday, and it struck me, of what happened before the call to order of the professor, and she proposed to call it study. Perhaps I entirely misunderstood, what she was telling, but I like this idea of the study, And well, I think we can call studies a space of those operations which expand the subjective capacity and the space of effectiveness of those egalitarian modes of circulation of food and knowledge. And this is a slow time, of course, a time devoted to working on other experiences of time. Now, this slow time of the unexplanation may also find its resonances in other temporal modes of disruption of the dominant temporality or other forms of unexplication. I'm thinking here of those moments of interruption for which, in the places and streets of many cities around the world, unexpected crowds of anonymous persons responding to calls made through the social networks and not by the self-proclaimed political organizations gathered in the streets without specific claims, just to affirm their distance, from the way in which the space and time of our lives are managed by the alliance of state authorities and financial oligarchies. This is, I think, the deep meaning of the notion of occupying. An occupation is a form of relationship between the distribution of spaces and times and the exercise of a capacity. Well, I recalled earlier the way in which Plato had defined the task of the artisan, or explained, it is an explanation, the task of the artisan by a twofold restriction. The artisan had to stay all the time in the workshop and do only and do only one job, the job fitting his capacity, for two reasons that made a circle. First, time doesn't wait. Second, the God had given him the capacity for this occupation and for none other. While in the history of the working class movement, the occupation of the workplaces was a means for both a reappropriation of this time and space of work and an affirmation of equal intellectual capacity. In the 1960s, the occupation of the university by the students was intended to stop the machine producing and reproducing the social hierarchy. So occupation then is a form of unexplanation, a disconnection of the links between the distribution of spaces and times and the distribution of capacities and incapacities, of course. Well, we live now in a time in which, on the one side, factories are closed and industry relocated far away. On the other side, the dominant time machines produce and reproduce an imaginary concordance and an actual discordance between the time of learning and the time of the economy. Such time requires another form of unexplanation, another form of occupation. The practice of occupying then becomes a way of reconstructing common space and a common temporality for individuals that the system isolates. This reconstruction of the common entails the experimentation of new use of time and new exercise of intellectual capacity. Well, of course, those moments we all know have been criticized as ephemeral movements unable to change anything to the dominant order because it had no program, no strategy for the long term. I think that we can turn the argument about the ephemeral on its head. The ephemeral is a rupture within the logic of the dominant temporality. And the criticism about the ephemeral belongs itself to the temporal logic of explanation, the logic that makes the advent of equality be the result of a joint development of time, society, and knowledge. The promise that the very development of the time machine of capitalism would produce its destruction actually was an explanation of the explanation, a form of redoubling of the explicative logic. But I mentioned earlier how that promise had been overturned and had become the monotonous affirmation that nothing can change unless everything changes, which ultimately means that nothing will ever change, since everything will never be given. Instead, the ephemeral moments implement the logic of the everything is in everything, the whole of the logic of equality, and the whole of the logic of inequality, the whole of their conflict, is present everywhere at any moment. The history of the last 2 centuries has showed us how the possibility of new words had only been made thinkable out of some episodes of a few days, during which the normal course of time had been suspended and ordinary men and women had verified the equality of intelligence by setting to work unexpected capacities in the organization of collective life. Emancipatory politics exists, I think, as a form of extension of those moments that have created a time heterogeneous to the time of domination and that have disrupted the polis distribution of times and capacity. Well, it is time to conclude. It will not well be a real conclusion, but some kind of conclusion, however. Well, in conclusion, I wish to compare 2 stories of unlearning, which are 2 stories about unlearning the normal course of time. In his thesis on the concept of history, Benjamin takes up an anecdote about the French Revolution of 1830 in Paris. The anecdote of a man shooting at the clocks to stop time, just as Joshua is told to have stopped the sun. Well, Benjamin uses the anecdote in the framework of its conception of messianic time. But it is clear that the story, this anecdote, is a mere invention, And, well, And what is more disturbing for me, you know, this anecdote first was the invention of learned people, you know, eager to show the stupidity of the rioting mob or the utopian dreamers that think that you can change everything by just shooting at the clocks. Well, this is why I prefer another story of stupidity, another way of learning, unlearning time. One of the landmarks of the occupation of the Gezi Park in Istanbul was the performance of the so-called standing man. During five hours, you know, he stayed, you know, he stood still, silence, you know, with his hand in his pocket, and his eyes, you know, staring at the portrait of Atatürk, hanging from the top of the Atatürk Cultural Center in Gezi Park, which of course provoked, you know, first gathering, you know, around him, you know, and people asking what was happening, you know, and of course being inspired by this happening, you know, and also of course, which created some trouble for the police because, well, you know, the logic, the Algerian logic, you know, the hey you know, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, you know, because because he stands still. He does no trouble, in a way he does no trouble, and the trouble is that it does no struggle. Well, I think, in a way it's another form of stupidity, but in this case I think the stupid attitude of the silent man just looking, you know, at this portrait without giving any explanation, you know, took on another significance, you know, and in the case, you know, of narrated by Benjamin. It was part of a collective action about the very use of a space, an action aimed at keeping the indeterminacy of a place made for sitting, walking, discussing, or just doing nothing. In contradistinction to the will of the power to transform this vacant space into a useful place, meaning both a military building and a shopping mall. So the stupidity of the standing man then symbolizes the creation of a space of experimentation of new use of time and new demonstration of an equal capacity, ranging, in this case, from the collective discussions of the meaning of the movement to the organization of daily life under the tents. This is why I think that this performance can also provide us with a good image of what unlearning may mean as both an entirely negative and an entirely positive process. Thank you for your patience.
Questions?
Thank you very, very much for all your writing and for the presentation. I was just kind of struck when you were talking about a community of equal-speaking beings, and I brought back to in the schoolmaster when you talked about society of contempt or inequality's passion is contempt. And one, it's two sides of the question. One is the question of translation, maybe, in terms of, I think it's mépris was contempt, and do you find that translation of inequality's passion as contempt or as mépris is well translated in terms of contempt? And then I was thinking about in the English language the sense of contempt and inequality as a kind of knowingness, that maybe in French sense of donner entendu, or a kind of knowingness. And I would just like to hear from you about that because what I remember most from the ignorant schoolmaster was that little tiny phrase that, like, inequality's passion is contempt. So I'm wondering maybe what is equality's passion as the opposite to contempt?
Well, the point is that in a way, you know, and it is always a problem, you know, but in a term we have, in a sense, you have a term for the logic of inequality, you know, which means that you can summarize, you know, this whole logic of inequality, you know, into one word, you know, content, you know. So in a way, you know, there is, I think what is interesting in this case, there is a specific affect, but at the same time, this specific affect, you know, is not a matter of personal feeling, you know, it's interiorization of a system. The system can work, you know, on the basis, you know, on the opposition between those who know and those who don't, and those who don't know. Or it can work, you know, on the basis of a kind of circulation of content, because what is important, you know, what I found important, you know, in Jacques' case, you know, was content is not only, you know, the relation, you know, of the high to the low, you know, but content works, you know, at all the levels of the society, you know. And we know how, for instance, even in the classroom, you know, the content, you know, of the professor, you know, for the illiterate young people from the suburbs, you know, of course, is reversed, you know, in the content, you know, of those illiterate young youths, you know, the people who think that he's a buffon, you know. Well, so I think this is important to that you know that there is this kind of this notion, this affect, you know, really summarizing the whole system as in the form of an affect. You know. And the point is that in a way there is no equivalence. There is no equivalent, you know, in the case of what I call the passion for equality, you know, in a way, you know, I defined, you know, equality, through a series of operations, of intellectual operation, you know. But it's true that in a way, you know, there is I cannot imagine now, you know, an affect, you know, but it would be the opposite of contempt, you know. I don't think that, for instance, esteem or respect, for instance, could be, you know, a good name for this affect.
Hi. Thanks very much. I enjoyed the talk, but I disagreed with your representation of journalism. I think that it was a caricature, and I think that it didn't really reflect any structure of kind of television journalism that I know in Britain. And I was just wondering that if maybe, I don't know what television journalism in France is like, but normally I don't think you get one expert who will come along to explain, to tell us the truth. The structure is often one of several different sorts of disagreeing experts to actually introduce a sense of confusion or dispute. So, I mean, I can see the point that you're making, but I don't think that really the world is really like that. I think that there's a tendency towards introducing dissensus, or disagreement, disagreement, dispute. And I wonder if maybe looking at the structure of television journalism rather than relying on a little kind of caricature would have changed your argument slightly, maybe?
Well, I don't know, you know, if it is a matter, you know, of discrepancy, you know, between French television, English television, etc. I was speaking, you know, about first of all the media in general, you know, and probably, and you may know, you know, that in France, you know, some years ago, there was a new theory about the task of the media. The idea was the task of the media is not to inform, it is to decipher information. Which means, in my way, it is to turn, you know, any event, you know, any trivial event into an enigma, because you can only decipher what is ciphered. And in the case, of course, you can decipher, in ways that are more or less sophisticated. Not the same thing in Le Monde and at the TV news, But basically, I think regarding the experts, I think that there are two different things, First, the news. First, in the news, you have the event and you have one expert, And you can have after, later in the evening, people gathered with opposite opinion on the same thing. But I think that there are two different structures, And what interests me is the structure that accompanies, any event with its explication. And I don't say it's the whole of the practice. Of TV, and it's not. Of course, it's not the way in which it works on Fox News, for instance. Precisely, it works on the basis of a kind of pedagogical TV, which is supposed precisely to give the explanation of anything. But you say it's a caricature. But it's very often caricatural, in the fact, if you find, for instance, in the radio news, in France, in cultural channels, France Culture, France Music, etc., you cannot have an event, happening, of course, for instance, in Gaza, happening in Palestine, without the presence of an expert, because there is a research team, of the National Center of Research, and there is an expert who is called, and of course the expert will speak for instance 1 minute, probably 1 minute, and what the expert basically will say is that, well, the Arabs don't like the Jews and the Jews don't like the Arabs. And it happens really, I would say, on cultural channels, and it's not it is the most striking point, because the main point is this necessity really of explaining, deciphering everything, and of course it can leave of course room for the big debates. But controversial debate. But I think precisely there is a separation, between the space devoted to debate, to controversial points, and the space devoted to information, which precisely is a space when there is this kind of coupling of the information and the explanation.
Thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask you basically to talk about the form of inequality that we call race, in the sense that the example that you attributed to me of study comes from this great book that I don't know if you've read, The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Hani. And the study in question is, they talk about black study as an oppositional mode to the university that I think is very in keeping with what you call intellectual emancipation. But the fact of race makes a huge difference to the argument. So, and the other piece of the subtitle is about fugitivity. So I wanted to ask you, in the example you just gave of the classroom, you have a white school teacher and immigrant kids, and the school teacher's like, you know nothing because you don't know what I know, so now I have to teach you, which is exactly that French film that in English was called The Class. I don't know what it was called in French. But so can we think about an inequality that is a bit more specific, and what difference it might make to talk about this inequality as a racial inequality, and to think about a form of knowing that is a racialized form of knowing, and to think about an aesthetic that is, for example, what Fred Moten calls a black aesthetic, that is everything that Enlightenment aesthetics are not, because it has been sort of assigned that role of noise, say. So just to play that out a little bit, the idea of race.
Well, the point, the point about the idea, in a sense, I would say that, the idea of race, in a way, I would say is denied in both ways. I mean, when you are, for instance, if you think of what happens in the fields of art, for instance, in a way, race is denied, under the concept of culture. So in fact, in a way, so of course, black music and all kind of alternative aesthetics, are welcomed as cultures, and as kind of widening of the space of culture. While on the other hand, in the space, of the class, of course, we must not caricature, but let us say that, the fact of race is denied behind the idea of cultural handicap. So there's cultural handicap. So there are people coming from suburbs, coming from families, coming from backgrounds, which precisely, have not, all that is more or less, incorporated in the capacity and attitudes of the white students, Well, and in a way, the point is, that of course, there is a long story. I would say of civilization, of the white people in France. It started with the French peasants. Then of course, then came, the immigrants coming from Italy, from Spain, from Poland, etc., and then of course came the immigrants, so coming from Maghreb, coming from Black Africa, but with always this kind of reproduction, in a way, of the same dramaturgy, There are people coming from a bad background, And the point is that the same people can come from can be, students coming from a bad background in the school, and become artists representing an enlargement of culture, if they succeed, as rappers and rockers, etc. So, or as dancers. So I think the point about race is that, in a way, probably it depends, on the country. But in France, I think the specificity of France is that the very idea that there is an issue about race, is dismissed. There is an issue about cultures. There is an issue about background, but no issue about race. But it is the way in which I perceive what happens in my country. You must not generalize.
Right, thanks very much for the lecture. I have just a point of clarification, because I don't know if I have a question yet. You made a statement in relation to Samuel's talk where you suggested that the logic of explanation overcomes or undoes any economic logic, right? So given the extent to which human capital dominates education in terms of policy, in terms of ideology, are you suggesting that we should avoid looking at education through the lens of political economy? Or how, in what way does this logic of explanation challenge the economic logic of human capital?
So some still was in a way about in a way the pedagogy, the neoliberal pedagogy, and the fact that the neoliberal pedagogy could never really, fit, the logic of the university. And I try to comment, on this point from my own point of view. By saying that, the logic of capital, the logic, you know, of capitalism is a logic of course, global subordination, global subordination to the law of capitalist domination, you know. But well, but you know, it's, you know, the global subordination, you know, is not necessarily produced, you know, by the importation, you know, of an economic logic inside, you know, the system, the educational system, you know. And well, my point is that, you know, well, the institutions of inequality are not simply institutions that work by succeeding, you know, so producing, you know, so the kind of individuals, you know, that they want to produce, you know, as you know, agents of a process of production, you know. They also produce, well, what can be told, but perhaps impoverished subjects, you know. So they also produce, you know, the sense of of incapacity, the sense of inability. So I think, and of course, the point. I recall, you know, that there was big debate in the time of Bourdieu in France. You know, school is supposed to produce equality. In fact, it produces inequality, and there was this agitation, you know, accusing the professors, you know, of not achieving equality. But my point is that global, you know, that whatever, you know, the goodwill of the teachers may be, you know, the global logic of the system, you know, is, well, to produce not only an adaptation of people, you know, to the conditions of capitalism, you know, because, well, the conditions of work, you know, under financial capitalism, you know, move you all the time, you know. So in a way, the problem is, well, to produce subordination, and you produce subordination from through a certain feeling of incapacity. And I think, well, what I think is also important is that it is not only as in the logic, you know, of Bourdieu, this kind of reproduction of the sense of incapacity of the student coming from, you know, poor backgrounds. It is also a sense of incapacity really inherent in the functioning of the machine itself, you know, so I've left you know, the French University 14 years ago, you know, but at the same time I follow what happens, you know. And well, I'm struck, you know, by the way in which also the system works, you know, in relation to the professors, you know, by making them all the time, you know, while feeling that they cannot achieve what they should achieve. And well, for instance, you know, with this new logic, you know, of the repartition of the money, etc., etc. Well, for instance, university professors all the time they have to make reports, you know, reports in which they pretend to do something, but they don't do, you know, because now most of the activity in the university is devoted to writing programs and reports, you know, telling this is what we do, and what we do, of course, is just what is required by the ministry. And of course, it is a lie, and so people, you know, in the university now have to spend a lot of time, you know, to this task of being good liars, you know. But well, which means precisely also a kind of circle of humiliation. Because it's humiliating, you know, to spend half of your time, you know, to lie, you know. Well, so this is what I meant.
I have the next question, I think. This comes out of the fact that I love explanations. Though, you know, I'm eager to. I'm very open to your argument at the same time. So I'm wondering how you would, I guess, put what I'm about to say in the context of the way you think about explanation. on the phenomenological or psychological level, I think explanations are transformative. And therefore always have that potential to unsettle subjectivity. That is, once you've heard an explanation of something and you've felt that change your mind, it's you know that your mind is changeable. And so I wonder if there isn't something within explanation's own way of working that isn't ever final. I mean, I at least, I'm sure this is true of many people, though certainly not everybody. I don't ever need the explanation to be the final explanation. Because then I would no longer have the fun of being transformed by explanations. The ones I come up with are the ones that other people come up with. So I'm not sure where you would locate, I guess, that phenomenological experience of a change of mind.
Well, I think, what I call the logic of explanation, is much more, when I go after Jacques, the logic of explanation, is much more, than the exercise, for which, for instance, while you are in front of some kind of, opaque material, and you try, to explicate it in the sense, of undoing the complexity, or making what was not visible appear, and so provoking changes, Well, I think, there is a kind of technicity, of some intellectual operations, that have been, described as an explanation. So I'm speaking about something, in the presence, of other people, and those other people, get some new insights, some new knowledge, or some new intellectual perspective from what I am saying. So I think, I have nothing against it. If we can produce the effect that people, but people have understand something, but they did not understand, know something, but they know something, but they did not know, etc., etc. I think, I think it's certainly a good thing, So, but the logic of explanation for me is much more into a kind of a framework, inside which all those technical, intellectual operations are integrated, so that, so that in this framework, producing an effect of knowledge on somebody at the same time is producing the feeling of their incapacity. So I think for me it is a kind of systemic notion, explanation, rather than the name of a specific intellectual operation. This is why, for instance, when I spoke about this kind of the way in which the explicative system, works, in the university today, is not so much a matter of pedagogical relationships, as it is a matter really of the organization of time and anticipation of the effect and things like this.
You oppose to the logic of explanation at one point, just very briefly, what you call an art of equality, an art of equality in a community of equals. And I'm presuming that means, or I suppose I'm trying to imagine what that might mean, and in particular in a post-capitalist context, an art of equality. And so just to sort of, ask specifically about that notion, do you mean something like the idea, which is very common in the revolutionary romantic tradition, for example, everyone an artist, or every worker an artist? I mean, do you imagine in a post-capitalist context a democratic diffusion of art throughout human society? And if that's the case, what then do you mean by the figure of the artist? And the reason I ask that in particular, thinking about this paper in particular, is there a danger? I'm not sure about this. I'm genuinely asking this in an open way. Is there a danger that in such a context art is reduced to a form of workmanship, a very functional conception of art, which might carry with it a danger of anti-intellectualism, precisely the reverse, the opposite of a society which reifies intellectuals as purveyors of explanation?
Well, I'm not sure, I'm not sure I entirely, understand the background, because I think there is a background to your question, and of course the question, in asking a question, of course, receiving a question sometimes, we have not the background, behind the question. Well, basically, first thing, I'm not proposing some kind of utopia of art, no, I'm not speaking of what art, should become, in a process or in a post-capitalist society, No, my point about about art, well, is my point was about thinking the knowledge relations, as forms of practice of art, meaning that when we learn that in the relationship, for instance, of the one who teaches something, the one who learns something, the point is not transmitting knowledge. The point is first making sentences, So when you explain something, in the sense that has been so evoked, in the last question, when you explain something, in the good sense of the word, what you are not trying, you are not transmitting your knowledge to somebody else, You are first, making sentences for being understood, which means first making sentences for understanding yourself, what you are doing, Which means, of course, thinking, of the art of writing, of teaching, of lecturing, as a different practice, as a different practice, in relation to the practice, based on the idea that knowledge is here, the ignorant is here, and you must transmit knowledge to the ignorant. No, my point about art, is you have two speaking beings, and you make sentences, first, to make clear what you have in mind, which also means, putting also the expression of your thought, in the status, of a work of art, meaning something, the other, looks at, something the other looks at, not knowing what he has to do with it. So I think, the point, is that we must make a distinction, between, the institutional idea of art, and what is meant by art here, because precisely many artists, don't practice art, in the sense that I am trying to define, but many artists precisely, they have the idea that they will produce this effect, with their work, with their artwork, etc., etc. So I think in my point of view, you know, the idea of art, you know, or this is well the idea precisely of a performance of a speaking being, performance, you know, which is a kind of verification, which is a verification of the equality of intelligence in its very formulation. You know, the point is not, for me, the point is not, for instance, there is knowledge. How will I transmit knowledge to the students? You know, no. The point is, what am I telling? You know, and my point, you know, when I write a paper, you know, my point, you know, at each moment is not, you know, will it be clear, you know, for the students, you know, it is first, is it clear for myself, you know, is it clear for myself, meaning it is really a form of verification, you know, of an integral capacity, you know, that can be shared by anybody, you know. And so this is, of course, so this is an idea of the practice of art as a form of communication of thought, you know, precisely out of the hierarchical situation. You know. And so it's not at all, you know, a kind of vision of the role of art, you know, as a specific sphere, you know, of activity in society.
We have a little less than 5 minutes and already 3 more questions, so I'll ask the last questioners if they can to be brief.
Just have a quick question. This is a little bit picking up on the previous question. That was a very powerful image of the man in the park in Istanbul silently staring, which is a political statement. Also, would you consider that also to be a work of art, to be aesthetic? And if so, what are the implications of that for contemporary artists? Should contemporary art aspire to this idea of unlearning, the idea of the emancipated spectator? It's a little bit picking up on your previous question. That's a very powerful image, but it's also outside a lot of the sort of traditional context of art as well. And where does that leave art then? And you know, people working in more traditional discipline media. It's also a very exciting tension between the political and the aesthetic in that image of the man in the park in Istanbul.
Well, of course, in this case, you know, I think the question is the question of the relation between the politics of aesthetics and an aesthetics of politics. You know, well, the point is that, you know, of course, it's something that we can all perceive. You know, for instance, that political protests, you know, now are more and more, you know, really constructed as artistic performance. You know, when I was young, you know, many protests, you know, there were the unions, the parties, you know, and so and it was clear that now, you know, everybody, or almost everybody, you know, comes to the protest with you know, his or her own sign, or own slogan, you know. So it appears more and more as a kind of bodily performance, you know, precisely, mixing the forms of contemporary performance, you know, on the stage of art with new forms of protest, or new forms of self-affirmation in a common space, you know. In this case, you know, of course, the standing man was not any man at all. You know, he was himself a performer. So we can at the same time, you know, it's a kind of performance which is difficult to perform, you know, on the stage of a theater. You know. It's very difficult if you have not really, you know, an audience, you know, entirely, you know, ready to accept anything, you know, to stand during 5 hours, you know, not doing anything in front of an audience, you know. So I think there is this kind of precisely twofold relation, you know. And in a way, there is a kind of shift from the aesthetic performance to the street, but at the same time, you know, this performance by becoming a political performance in a street, is something that, well, that people can accept, and they will not accept it on the stage, on the stage or the stage of a theater, So I think we witness, all the time, this kind of new, intertwinements between forms of political actions and forms of art. And precisely in this case, what is interesting is that it is a form of art which doesn't anticipate anything, in the traditional form of political art, Because I remember, for instance, when I was young, for instance, in the time of the 68, there were attempts, at reviving practices, of street theater, But at the same time, it was so stereotyped, the content of the scenes, and the forms of the action, it was so stereotyped, It could only, produce effects on people that who were convinced in advance, But in this case, it's different precisely because there is a kind of political manifestation which is about occupying a place, reorganizing life in this place, and you have this artistic practice which is part of this kind of political happening.
Hi Jack, thank you very much for the talk. I'm interested in the art of equality, and I'm interested in how do we put this into practice, and whether you have been practicing in your everyday life, either in your class or in your writing, or, and also whether this can be translated to another culture, for example Chinese culture, which has a very strong structure of hierarchy due to the Confucianism, the tradition, that the students are taught they have to always respect their teacher, no matter what. So it means that the teachers, whatever they say, even though the things that they say might be wrong, the students have to respect that as well. So for a culture like that, how can we articulate your philosophy of the art of equality into the society or into that culture?
I think that everywhere, there are different forms also of organization of intellectual life. For instance, in the case of China, of course, there is this respect for hierarchy, and at the same time, there are things, circulating on the internet. So I gave talks, talks in some places in China. Well, I would say that the discussion was not different, but different, in China as it could have been, in the United States or in Brazil or in Germany, in a way. Which means that I think that perhaps because I was speaking in art schools and not in universities, and in art school after a very long, of course, a very long history, of the relation between art and politics. But I don't know. But the point is that at the same time, I felt the discussion was the same, but everywhere, which is a problem because in a way it means, and it's always a problem with the discussion after a lecture. Is it really an egalitarian exchange, or is it part of a ritual? But what is more interesting is, but there were a lot of comments, on the internet. I was told also an extravagant number, of comments, because my talks were posted on the internet and people were reacting. What was the reaction? I don't know. But I don't suppose, that there were reaction, of respect, to the hierarchy, and I don't think so. So I think, for me, the problem, is, you have to dissociate things, So you try to speak to equal people, And so, you know, and well, what happens, you don't know, you know, to the same institution, because you were talking about China. I remember at first I was received, you know, in a huge, you know, living room, you know, with two authorities of the academy, you know, in big armchairs, you know, and it was quite stereotype, and there were still, you know, paintings of the anti-Japan war, you know, and paintings of the revolution, etc., etc. You know. Well, and then I went to the places, you know, where students were exhibiting, you know, their work, you know, and trying to tell me what they wanted to do with their works, you know, and what you know, and what I thought, you know, about it, you know, with of course this mixing of hierarchical and non-hierarchical relationships, you know, at the same time, of course, you know, asking the visiting professor, you know, to just to cast a look, you know, on your work, you know, and say something, you know, but at the same time, also trying to create a kind of egalitarian relationship by saying this is what I wanted to do, you know, and what do you think? What do you think about it? So, but basically, my point is, well, anyway, we are still in this kind of connection, you know, of egalitarian and unegalitarian practices, you know, and even if you are when you are in a university, you know, so you have tasks that are defined, you know, by the logic of the university, of the system, of the expectations of the students, etc., you know, and this is part, you know, of your activity, and the part of your activity is just trying to tell, trying to tell what you have to tell, which first means trying to understand, you know, what you are doing, what you are searching for, you know, and telling it, you know, without knowing, you know, what it will become, you know. So this is what I can say, you know, about this.
Well, maybe it's apt, or is this not? Okay, so maybe it's apt to ask a couple of questions that are asking you to reflect on some of the other speakers. So I was thinking about what Jacques was saying about a lecture being a modelling of thought, and how readily so many of my students would see that as a mode of explanation or explication. And my thought, when you were saying that, I thought about Heidegger, Aaron's descriptions of Heidegger and passionate thinking, oddly enough, but thinking becoming alive. And I just wonder about what distinctions you might make there. And I was also thinking about Deborah Blitzman. So fine, I have an opinion about equality of intelligence, and I agree with you on that. But it's very complicated when I go into the space of a classroom, which, as you were saying, are unique spaces, to work. Jean-Pierre says you work the invisible. To work the invisible in some sense, so that, and the very complicated affective dynamics, so that people can come to have a sense of the equality of their intelligence. So I'm talking here about a lot of my work with people who are in prison or out of prison or homeless and so on, who have a strong belief in the principle of their inequality of intelligence, because that's what's being told to them all their lives. And you don't say a huge amount about the practicalities of working with that affective terrain. So a statement is one thing, but how would you feel, how would you go about doing that in practice?
Well, as I told you, I always taught, either in a high school, or in a university, of course, which is a kind of protected space, you know. Even though, for instance, Paris 8 in Saint-Denis was not exactly entirely a protected space, because well, precisely, because precisely, you know, the population, you know, was quite heterogeneous, you know, because there was at the same time, of course, the young people coming from the northern suburbs of Paris, you know, and people coming from Brazil or from Taiwan or Japan, because it was the University of Foucault and Deleuze and Lyotard. You know. And well, my own point, you know, has always been that I speak in the same way, you know, to every kind of audience, So that's one. My point is, you know, well, do I have something to say? That's the point, you know. With the idea that if you have something to say, you know, if the students, you know, have the idea that there is something, you know, but something to get into it, you know, he or she will make the effort of trying to grasp what you are telling, and of course in very various ways, you know, with very different outcomes, you know. But basically, I think the point is, you know, in a classroom, the first point probably is also to be confronted with the hierarchy of the students' group itself, you know, because a classroom, in fact, you know, is hierarchical itself, you know. I mean that there are some speakers, you know, that are accredited, authorized, you know, speakers, you know, among the students and others who are not. So there is a kind of dynamic of the group, a kind of complexity of the relationship, you know. Well, I tried. Of course, I always tried, you know, as I said, you know, to do at the same time two different things. You know, I'm in front of students who come here because they want a degree, you know, basically, you know. And I am here in front of people who think that I have something to tell to them, you know, and I try to manage, you know, the relation between those two activities, and there is no, you know, right method, you know, in my opinion, you know, just always. You try, you make mistakes, and you correct your mistakes, you know. But again, you know, I've always, you know, taught in mostly taught in protected, you know, environments, you know. So I cannot, you know, really tell how I would have managed, you know, in the case, you know, of homeless or prisoners. Of course, having a very different relationship to matters of education and also to matters of equality.
Join me all in thanking Jacques.
To evoke another cliche, all good things must come to an end. So, without further ado, can I just introduce Ranciere, you're from the School of Education in Trinity College, and have the concluding remarks.
I won't keep you very long, and it's, I think, very apt that in a sense, the official face of this institution should come last, given the themes and the challenges and the wonderful thoughts that we've engaged in the last 2 days. My apologies, I wasn't here yesterday. I came in late last night. In fact, two of us here, the others came in late last night from another conference in Porto. However, I do need to say just a couple of things by way of thanks, by way of invitation, and by way possibly of bidding farewell. As Eamon said, my name is Ranciere, and I'm the current director of the Cultures, Academic Values and Education, the CAVE, chosen consciously, the CAVE Research Centre in the School of Education. And on behalf of the Research Centre, on behalf of the School of Education, on behalf of this old and rickety college, this Trinity College in Dublin, I would like to express my deepest thanks. The speakers of the last 2 days have graced this fine institution with their presence, with their thought, with the work that went in, the obvious work that went into the wonderful presentations that I was tweeted and emailed about, and the ones that I heard today. So in particular, please, on behalf of us all, I would like to extend a heartfelt thanks on behalf of the institution to Jacques Halberstam, to Paul Bowman, to Eileen Joy, Aranya Frautenberg, to Nick Roy, to Lauren Bellon, to Sam Chambers, to Deborah Britzman, and to Jacques Ranciere. Thank you so much for being here. Eamon and Katie, whom you've come to know, are conducting their PhD research. Eamon, strangely for the second time round, but conducting their research in the Cave Research Centre with us. And when Eamon came to me with his very good friend Michael O'Rourke many months ago and suggested things, I'm delighted to say that my excitement about the project overcome my enormous anxieties about finances and logistics and the rest. And while my anxieties about the finances particularly and the logistics haven't gone away completely, I have to say that the excitement is still there. But the excitement is there in a very different way, and obviously different way, because of what I have heard and because of what I know has happened here. So I need to thank them most particularly. Eamon and Michael, thank you so much for bringing this idea to fruition, and a very special thank you to Katie for actually making it happen to a large extent. So to the three of you, thank you very much. A few other folk who deserve our thanks as well, and if you just bear with me very briefly while I name them, because a lot went on in the background, both here in the hub and with the catering, and particularly with the website and so on and so forth. So to Victor Taylor, Carl Raschke, to Sam Kyo, Leanne Maguire, Valerie Kelly in the School of Education, Gareth Stack, Graham Price, John Mitchell and Tina Kinsler. Again, a heartfelt thank you for all your work in making this happening for all of us here today. To all of you, if we've learnt anything over the last 2 years, 2 days, one thing is the power of contingency. We will never ever be together again in this room, in this constellation. I think that's probably a safe enough statement of fact. But something powerful can happen, and something powerful happens when something, a particular thing, the contingent, the accidental meeting of a group of people. So I thank you all for coming here, for coming to the hub, to Trinity. I thank you for your careful listening, your thoughtful reflections, your contributions, and so on. You have made the event as well in your own way. You will, as I do, take away, be a changed, transformed human being, I think, as a result of what has happened in the last 2 days. So thank you also to all who have made the journey, some of whom and some that I met in breaks today have come a long distance, some of them many thousands of kilometres, to be here and to hear these great thinkers and these wonderful thoughts. So thank you to you. Now, very finally, I have a couple of things. We will retire here from the Trinity Long Room Hub, but you're all very warmly invited to join us at the Old Stone, which is a tavern, a public house, a pub, whatever you like, however you know one of these things, I think Katie or one of us will be able to, we meet outside, lead us out one of the little side gates, I'll give you the key, to the institution, and we'll let us out and make our way over there. So do please, if you can join us, please do that. If I could ask all of our wonderful speakers to join us at the top here, just for a little photo op. We can't let the opportunity go. Just for a final photograph with us all and with the organisers as well. And to those who can't join us in the Old Stone and continue a little bit of chat and conversation, please have a safe journey home. The cave, by the way, is always open. I forgot to mention this. We're always interested in new cave dwellers. So anybody interested in our work, please do chat to me afterwards or chat to Katie and the rest. To the rest of you, whether your journey be short or be long, take care, safe home, and thank you very much.